Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Where should we go to first? Well, some Russian insanity. Meet Lieutenant General Andrei Gurulev, who demands that Russian scientists should develop biological weapons that will only affect the Anglo-Saxons to counter US biological labs in Norway, of course. Quote, "We need to deal with the Anglo-Saxons. This is the main enemy," he said. Nuts. Absolutely nuts. I don't know if I can add any commentary to that other than just what? So we'll move on. We're going to jump into this article that Shashank Joshi shared on the Wall Street Journal. Why the war in Ukraine may not deter China. And I've been talking about how actually China are going to be watching the Ukraine conflict closely, because if Russia are defeated on account of the unity of NATO and the West, particularly the US, with Ukraine, then that may deter China from trying to do anything funky with Taiwan. But this article says, yeah, not so much. But nonetheless, I don't know. I think I disagree a little bit with it, to be honest, but there are some good points in it. So Yaroslav Trofimov states in the article at the beginning, quoting Zhu Bo, so a recently retired senior colonel in the People's Liberation Army, so the Chinese army, quote, "Russia's military image and credibility have crumbled." So this is a retired Chinese colonel saying this, a senior colonel. It's really important. Russia's military image and credibility have crumbled. This has become a war they did not expect. Exactly what I've been saying since the beginning, that they were accidentally in this war. It was a special military operation to begin with. It went wrong and turned into a war, and they were ill prepared for it. Taiwan plays a much more central role in the global economy, with a GDP nearly 4 times the size of Ukraine's and a near monopoly on manufacturing advanced semiconductors that are indispensable for modern technologies. So there are lots of reasons why the US and others might be interested in supporting Taiwan here, because actually, if China was to control Taiwan, then China would control the semiconductor market in the world. And that is huge. So you talk about military being dependent on technology, and that technology is dependent on semiconductors, military equipment. Then that's interesting. When you talk about computing power, when you talk about technological advancements, when you talk about all those massive corporations set up, US corporations like Google, all of these huge corporations, how dependent are they on Taiwanese semiconductors? I don't know, but you can imagine that Taiwan is a far, far more important, kind of geopolitically speaking, far more important potential conflict than one might imagine. It's not just about defending Taiwan because, hey, we're the nice guys, but actually there's some vested interests on both sides. I mean, sure, that's why China wants to get hold of Taiwan. That's why the West will want to defend Taiwan against China. As Chinese Navy and Air Force intensify war drills around Taiwan, Chinese officials hold their cards close to their chest. They insist that the events in Ukraine will have no bearing on their own decisions when it comes to Taiwan. They bristle at what they call American attempts to Ukrainize the Taiwan issue. Quote, "Of course, the war in Ukraine should stop as soon as possible, but whatever happens, there should not hinder our reunification efforts," said Kui Tiankai, a former Chinese ambassador to Washington and deputy foreign minister who remains influential in Beijing's establishment. Quote, "For us in China, national reunification is the goal, whatever international environment we might have." Chinese leader Xi Jinping has set a 2027 deadline for turning the PLA into a world-class military, a term seen by US officials as a code for readiness to invade Taiwan. Lots of talk about sort of modernization of the army, so on and so forth. This is from who is this? I think this is from Zhu, who again is that the same chap that spoke earlier. So situation is difficult for Russia, but Russia still has more manpower, military strength, and overall national strength to support this war, said Zhu. President Putin cannot afford to lose this war. because how can he explain why all these people have died? He needs to justify this. On the other side, how can the Western support be sustained if the war becomes protracted? I think there's something in this that, it's a sunk cost fallacy. Russia can't pull out because otherwise they spent all those human lives on what? Nothing. On destroying the Russian military capability. So, and obviously capacity. So, yeah, they can't pull out. But on the other hand, a protracted war, what will the West support the protracted war? Now, this is where I'm going to bring in something I've been talking about myself recently. I've been saying uh, many of the nations are now turning ad hoc military aid and support for Ukraine into long term scheduled aid packages and assistance. And indeed, that is what Mick Ryan is mentioning here, or in reference to a Washington Post article. Quote: in recent weeks, the US and its allies have sought to steer conversations toward providing military support for Ukraine beyond the current offensive, with an eye on creating security arrangements that could deter Russia long term. And actually, you can talk about this possibly deterring China here. So if you start putting things in long term, say, like I said to you the other day, it sends such a big message. I think I said this on the live stream with Georgie from Ukraine Matters. It sends such a big message to China, to Russia, to Putin. If you say, right, like Norway and US are doing and other nations, we're going to put this thing almost contractually in place whereby we're going to give 5 years of assistance to Ukraine, not just a whole bunch now. This is going to take place over 5 years. We're going to give this in year one, this in year two, this in year three, this in year four, and year five. What does that say to Putin? Oh, bugger, actually, that's 5 years worth of aid. My plan on the Western allies getting bored of this, losing interest, and being able to win this thing by making it a protracted frozen conflict is much harder if some of these other nations have formally put in place support that is taking place over the medium to long term. And that's a really significant move. The article goes on to say, under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, the US supplies weapons to Taiwan, the only nation to do so on a significant scale. Taiwan is purchasing hundreds of Harpoon anti-ship missiles to counter a potential Chinese amphibious assault and is considering other military upgrades, major military upgrades. Authorities are still deciding, however, whether to shift to a so-called porcupine strategy, which would use widely dispersed weapons such as anti-ship, anti-tank, and anti-aircraft missiles to repel a land invasion. Taiwan's current policy gives priority to expensive ships and jets that can respond to China's ongoing air and naval probes, well short of war, near the island. Such large platforms would likely be destroyed in the first hours of a full-scale conflict. Though President Biden has repeatedly said that Washington would intervene should China invade Taiwan, there is no binding US commitment to do so, in contrast to an attack on a NATO ally. And of course, starting to think about actually getting involved with boots on the ground could lead. I mean, some analyses, as it goes on to say here, would indicate that US would lose huge amounts, and of course we'd be in World War III, right? It'd be absolutely horrific. So it's all about deterrence rather than how do we win a war when it happens. And that's in the way that you support Taiwan in the sorts of weapons that they are equipped with. It goes on to say later, I'm just picking out a few bits and pieces from this article because it's a really long read. I'd love to read it all to you, but hey, you would be bored pantsless. If the Russians screwed up, it doesn't mean that the Chinese leadership believes that it will also screw up, said Alexander Geburev, director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin and one of the leading Russian experts on China. Quote, they may think that Putin is an idiot, that the Russians have hollowed out their army by graft and that Russians lack motivation, whereas China is fine when it comes to motivation and may think we've built up the army instead of pilfering it away and everything will work out for us. So in other words, China won't necessarily be kind of emulating Russia's approach to the war. They will have a much more confidence based on reality rather than the Russian confidence based on a complete paper army, Potemkin army that's just not lived up to expectations. Whereas China would argue that theirs would be a very different kettle of fish. Right. Okay. Mirroring Russia's rhetoric, dismissing Ukraine's elected government as an illegitimate Kiev junta, and presenting itself as a liberator, China insists that the majority of the Taiwanese are really on its side. Quote, if we use military force to resolve the Taiwan issue, we would target the extreme minority of Taiwanese independence elements and foreign forces that interfere, and not the people of Taiwan, the PLA, Lieutenant General He Lei has said. Like other Chinese officials, General He scoffed at any comparisons between Ukraine and Taiwan, pointing out that no major nation grants diplomatic recognition to Taiwan's authorities. Quote, it's like comparing the beauty of a person with the beauty of a pig. Ukraine is a sovereign country, while Taiwan is an unalienable part of China's sacred territory. He said conflicts between two countries must be resolved through peaceful negotiations. So he's saying that it's just a false equivalence. You know, the conflict in Ukraine, which is a sovereign nation, and Taiwan, which is not a sovereign nation, is not recognized by everyone. Still, whatever you think, right, the one thing you've got to do, like self-determination, has to be worth something. You've just got to get a really good understanding from all of those people living in Taiwan, where do they want to live? As in, yeah, in Taiwan, but what do they want Taiwan to be? Do they want Taiwan to be an independent nation state, or do they want Taiwan to be part of China? A simple referendum that's, I don't know, you can get third parties to make sure it's free and fair referendum. You do that, and whatever they say, that's where you got to go. You know, that is democracy, and that is self-determination. So I think that's really important. The importance there, however, is trying to get a free and fair election, try to make sure that both sides are able to present their case fairly and truthfully, and not try and pull the wool over people's eyes. You know, there have been elections recently in other places where, you know, people are voting on account of a completely false idea of what they're voting for, and that skews the data then. And actually, you know, reality can come bite you on the arse. Here, you want both sides to be able to present their cases fairly, and of course, this is maybe a pipe dream, and say, right, now you go and do your vote, and everyone votes with, you know, the best knowledge at their fingertips. So, yeah, to many Taiwanese, the parallels with Ukraine are crystal clear. While fears of a Chinese invasion have been present ever since the Communist Party seized China's mainland in 1949, last year's Russian invasion drove home that the unthinkable can actually happen, sometimes with frightening speed. Quote, I hope that Xi has learned the good lesson from Ukraine. If you invade and try to bully a neighboring country, you are going to fail, and the whole world will stand together when more than you can imagine, said Wang Ting-yu, a senior member of the Taiwanese Parliament's Defense Committee. But if Xi Jinping has learned a lesson that he wouldn't make the strategic and tactical mistakes like Putin, that Putin is stupid, but Xi Jinping is smart, the lesson of how to win a war instead of how to not have a war, then the Ukrainian lesson may become a tragedy for China. Interesting. Right, I'm going to go to the BBC piece that I referenced in this morning's news video, talking about how they have been doing this open source work, intelligence work, to count up the Russian dead, and they've now counted 25,000 Russian dead as the absolute benchmark minimum. These are people that are definitely dead, and there are, you know, maybe death certificates, confirmation that they died in the war, and not just people in the army who happen to have died, or in it, you know, it may be that it's just someone in the army who happens to have a funeral, and they may have died in the war. But if there isn't that official connection between those two things, then they won't count those people. So it really is a very kind of robust minimum here, rather like Oryx does with their counting up of equipment loss, visual confirmation. This is visual confirmation, if you like, through social media and other platforms to confirm the deaths of Russian soldiers. And they found, as I said, 25,000. So let's just have a little look at some of this. I like some of the visual representations on here. We identified more than 25,000 40,000 named individuals. So this is, you can't get better than this really in terms of data. People, in a time of war, people we know to have died, setting a bare minimum for Russia's total losses. Some of them are pictured here. The count provides hard evidence of the war's impact on Russian forces, but it has also given answers to grieving families. So what they've also found is that many of the families that they have, that of some of these people that the BBC have found out, BBC Russia have found out have died, families didn't even know they've died. So they've been able to provide the evidence for the families and give some kind of closure. Some relatives did not even know what had happened to their loved ones until the BBC traced to them. And it does some case studies and sort of looks at individual people and whatnot. But it's some of this stuff that I find quite interesting. Right, okay. Let's go back there and see if we can redo that. Yeah, so this is the first 3 months of the war, right? So Russia lost large numbers of professional soldiers in the first 3 months. No prisoners, no mobilized civilians, because of course there were no mobilized, there were no prisoners fighting at that time. Wagner only 22 in the first 3 months. So this would be February, March, April last year, 2022. 792 officers. They lost a heck of a lot of officers early doors. Remember all that talk? The communication was poor, so officers were getting down on front line and then getting hammered. Privates and non-commissioned ranks, 2,279. Post-invasion volunteers are 280. Okay, then now look at the last 3 months, and it changes significantly. So the latest 3 months, non-professional soldiers are dying in far greater numbers. So now you've got privates and non-commissioned ranks, 398, officers, 148. So far less of like your regular armed forces here, and volunteers have gone up. Prisoners have gone up, obviously, infinitely, because they've gone from 0 to 1,236. Mobilized civilians as well, 780, and Wagner 752. So the bulk of the deaths over the last 3 months have taken place in this area: the prisoners, the mobilized, and the Wagner being used as well. So really significant change in the numbers there. Then it goes on. I mean, it's well worth reading this article. There's lots to glean from it. This is an interesting infographic. So, what the UK government said, back in February, is that between 40,000 and 60,000 troops had died. Right, that's the UK intelligence estimate. The BBC has now, a few months later, said, well, we know at least 25,000 have died, and that's what that looks like in terms of relative sized squares. So you can compare the numbers as an area, if you like. So the UK government 3 months ago, BBC now, and then it says here the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense estimates that there are more than 200,000 Russian casualties, but this also includes the wounded. And this is really interesting. This is where I often talk about what do liquidated personnel mean. The BBC, and I've told you this before, the BBC think that their liquidated personnel means wounded too. And there are some people, there's still no absolute clarity on what liquidated personnel means when the General Staff release those figures. Does it include the wounded? Does it not? Most people think it is dead, but some entities believe that it also includes wounded still. And that's why I still mention that sometimes. And people are like, oh, no, it definitely means dead. And yeah, you may think that you think that, and most people think that, but there's still people who don't think that. And here's an example. All of these figures dwarf the Russian claims of about 6,000. So that box there represents what the Russian government is claiming the number is of dead troops. And that is obviously under a quarter of what the BBC Russia and I think Mediazona have shown, categorically. So the Russians government is obviously lying, not telling the truth. Now you'd understand that in trying to manage the war and the narrative and not wanting their domestic population to know about the true extent of the catastrophe that this war is. But yeah, there's a massive difference between those figures. So yeah, interesting. And it goes on and on. I think it's a really creditable thing they are doing, the BBC here, and really good good public service that to do that kind of work, and also working with their arm BBC Russia. BBC has all these arms around the world that are doing stuff all the time on behalf of basically Britain and the British narrative, and that's kind of their job as a public service broadcaster. We have BBC World Service, which is super important around the world to many countries in producing things in English around the world, but also in local languages. Yeah, so here is it's a really good project there. Okay, I've talked about Mick Ryan's piece there. I'm going to talk a little bit about this article that Timothy Snyder points out, thorough discussion on the persuasive conclusions about Russia's means and methods of destroying the Novokhovka Dam in occupied Ukraine. Right, this New Lines magazine piece is really good. Damning evidence. Russia's culpability in Ukraine's biggest ecological disaster since Chernobyl. I've changed my mind. I said it's a hybrid explanation for the explosion, for the damage that was caused by the dam, and the dam exploding itself and falling down. But I think it's far worse because there was a fundamental weakness across the dam due to poor maintenance, but it was definitely an explosion that took place. And people like Ryan Beth say it's not an explosion, it was self-destruction, but the Russians are still culpable. I'd say, yeah, the Russians are culpable no matter what your opinion of what happened is, but actually there were definitely explosions involved, and that makes them even more culpable. So let's just have a quick run through some of the evidence again for the explosion. Okay, the most compelling evidence in support. So I'm just going to go through this section of the article up to here, just to talk about the evidence for the explosion. So the most compelling evidence in support of this today is a growing consensus that what destroyed the dam was an explosion, not failure due to poor maintenance while being occupied by the Russians, or the exceptionally high water levels in the Kakhovka reservoir in the days leading up to the failure. The dam and hydroelectric power plant were captured on February 24th in the early stages of the Russian invasion. They have been in Russian possession ever since. One early hypothesis after the flood was that the dam simply collapsed on its own due to the high level of the reservoir, putting abnormal strain on the structure already weakened by a number of artillery strikes over the past months. Yet the hypothesis has since waned in light of recent information suggesting an explosion was the cause of the failure. Experts interviewed by the New York Times reported the assessment that the dam was brought down by on-site intentional sabotage rather than being struck from without or collapsing from high water pressure. They point to the characteristic strength of such structures. I mean, this was built to withstand a nuclear missile, right? So and limited explosive payload of artillery shells, as well as the amount of damage sustained to the structure. Quote, even a direct hit may not take out the dam, Nick Glumack, engineering professor at the University of Illinois, told the paper. That takes a significant amount of energy. The Times followed up this article with another, citing a senior administration official who said the US spy satellites equipped with infrared sensors detected a heat signature consistent with a major explosion just before the dam collapsed. If anonymous US government sources aren't to your liking, then there is more attributable corroboration of their theory. The Bukovina seismic array, operated by the Norwegian seismic array NOSAR, detected what researchers at the organization called Clear Signals on Tuesday, June 6th at 2:54 a.m. local time. They concluded that the recorded signals showed the characteristics of an explosive source, and that the telemetry from the direction of the dam also recorded weak signals from an earlier seismic event at approximately 2:35 a.m. The data confirms eyewitness reports from Ukrainians posted in real time to local Telegram channels, as well as interviews subsequently given to Western journalists at The Economist and The Guardian. These eyewitnesses claimed there were big explosions coming from the direction of the dam beginning at 2:21 a.m., followed by the sound of rushing water. Note too that NOSAR's timing for the main blast, 2:54 a.m., is just 4 minutes later than the time cited by Zelensky's advisor Yermak. Video footage later published by a Telegram channel affiliated with the Wagner Group, Russia's notorious mercenary outfit fighting in Ukraine, later seemed to confirm a two-stage collapse. The short clip, which did not have a timestamp, showed the main span of the dam breached, but the pump house containing the main machinery of the hydroelectric power plant was intact. A blast emanating from within the structure would certainly implicate the Russians, at the time sole custodians of the dam, unless we allow for the remote Fleming-esque possibility that a third party, say Ukrainian saboteurs, managed to smuggle themselves into a well-guarded facility, lay explosive devices, and smuggle themselves out all undetected. Alexei Danilov, the chair of the Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, claimed that the same day the dam was breached, that Russian 205th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade was the culprit. culprit, as that brigade had apparently undermined the structure earlier. A post on a Telegram channel seemingly linked to the 205th and dated October the 20th appears to substantiate Danilov's accusations. The post details Russian plans to blow up the structure after Russian forces had retreated to the left bank of Dnipro in the face of determined Ukrainian pressure, or as part of Kyiv's counteroffensive in the area at the time. Actually, it's worse than that. They don't mention here the video of people admitting this that came out in November, I think it was, or was it December of 2022? So you have the written one in October on Telegram, and then you have video evidence of them admitting it. I mean, goodness me, if you're admitting to putting mines inside a dam on video and written evidence, I don't know what else it takes for you to think that they may well have mined it. Furthermore, it may what be an incredible coincidence. The Russian government amended, and this is important. Did I talk about this? I wanted to find out more information about this, but I don't think I mentioned it. In what may be an incredible coincidence, the Russian government amended Russian law explicitly prohibiting the investigation of dam failures a mere week before the Kakhovka Dam was destroyed. Decree number 873 states, until January the 1st, 2028, the technical investigation of accidents at hazardous production facilities and accidents at hydraulic structures which occurred as a result of military actions, sabotage and terrorist acts shall not be carried out. Why would you make that law? Why would you do that? And unless you're going to blow up a dam and then say, well, it can't be investigated. I mean, all the ducks are in a line and they are all pointing in one direction, those ducks, and they're all quacking the same quack. Ukrainian intelligence has also compiled evidence, albeit unverified, of Russians or pro-Russian collaborators pointing the finger at Moscow's forces. On June the 9th, Ukraine's security service, the SBU, released an intercept purportedly of 2 Russian service members chatting about the dam failure. Our sabotage group was there, one tells the other. They wanted to scare people with the dam. It didn't go according to plan, but more than they planned. And I reported that to you after the incident as well. Another intercept, this time released by Ukraine's military intelligence service, HUR, alleged has a pro-Russian Crimean blogger stating that Russian soldiers he had been communicating with confirmed that they'd abandoned their positions in the islands along the Dnipro by 3 a.m. on June the 6th. This suggests at least some Russian forces in the area had advance warning of the dam break because their side was the one responsible for blowing it up. Other Russian soldiers were not so lucky, the bodies of drowned Russian service members having been washed up on the banks of the Dnipro in the days since the breach. And other Russian soldiers posted images of themselves wading through chest-high floodwater in the immediate aftermath. Okay, so then it says, if we accept that the dam was breached by an explosion, then it becomes almost impossible to argue that anyone other than Russians were to blame. It goes on to talk about that kind of side of it and what would be the intention, so on and so forth. But I just thought that's a really nice synopsis of the evidence of the Russians being culpable for the dam exploding. And I advise you go and read the whole article. June the 15th article, so it only came out 2 days ago in New Lines magazine. And speaking of the dam, and a slightly shorter video today that you'll be happy to know, let's give you some animal love in terms of after the dam took place. So here we have a nice little puppy. I'm not sure you need to hear the boat though. So I'll just play you that little puppy getting saved in the Kherson area. Look at its little paws, its little sad eyes. So that's good news. Of course, so many animals, so many humans. I don't know how many people have perished, actually. The figures are really thin on the ground for that, but animals, insane amounts of animals. Lots of animals on a red list. I saw hundreds of salamander perished that were on a red list, which is a protected species list. So just absolutely devastating going forward for the ecosystems. Here's a cat I believe has been saved from the area, being fed by a soldier here. Just to give you some positivity to take away with you to continue going through your day in, I presume, relative safety compared to the front lines of Ukraine. Anyway, thank you so much for your support. Please like, subscribe and share. I'll be doing a live stream chat with Andrew Perpetua on Monday now, not today. And please, when you're drinking milk, don't spray it all over yourself like that. Take care. I'll speak to you soon.